Hey, hello everyone. This is Grace Parker. I am an OASIS Source Selection Advisor supporting the OASIS Small Business on-ramps as well as the A-Day SubPool on-ramping effort. So I'm going to be giving an overview of the A-Day SubPool on-ramping effort. This shouldn't take too long, so for those of you who are not an A-Day member, it should be pretty painless. But it's good to just have this for general awareness purposes of the kind of overall OASIS SB environment. So the objectives of the A-Day SubPool on-ramping are to expand the OASIS A-Day industry base, as well as best-in-class contract opportunities for A-Day requirements. So OASIS has become really popular over the last couple of years. It's a contract vehicle of choice for professional services requirements across the government, and we're hoping that that same dynamic can apply as well to these A-Day subpools, so that if an A-Day requirement comes up for professional services, ordering agencies know exactly where to go to in order to have that requirement fulfilled by technically capable contractors. The A-Day subpools will allow for both direct or sole source task order awards as well as competitive A-Day set-asides. Excuse me. The real rationale behind creating these subpools is driven both by market research and by customer demand for the subpool creation. This was something that was worked out collaboratively with the Small Business Administration over the course of the last couple of years. And there's really a demonstrated need for socioeconomic A-Day opportunities, which also fulfill agencies' goals for Tier 3 spend under management. We don't want agencies to have to pick between achieving their best-in-class goals and achieving their A-Day socioeconomic goals. So hopefully this solution is a win-win for our agencies to allow them to meet both of those goals through one particular requirement. Just a little bit of background on kind of how we got to where we are right now. The OASIS SB family of contracts was awarded in October of 2013. It was a total small business set-aside that provided for further socioeconomic set-asides in accordance with 15 U.S.C. 644 R1. At the time that these IDIQ contracts were awarded, there was no formal offer and acceptance into the A-Day program at the IDIQ level. The reason behind that was that the offer and acceptance process was envisioned to occur at the task order level. So upon the award of OASIS, agencies began relying upon OASIS to fulfill their A-Day set-aside and sole source goals and be able to issue the task orders using that capability. Following the solicitation closing of OASIS, the SBA issued final rule on task and delivery order contracts 78 FR 61113, which was effective in December of that year. And essentially what that final rule clarified was that if there's a contract that is a small business set-aside, the SBA considered it unfair to have further socioeconomic set-asides against that contract. And so because of this discrepancy between the original structure of the OASIS SB contracts and the SBA's final rule in place implementing that requirement, the SBA began in about the summer of 2017 declining or rejecting any new OASIS task orders offered into the A-Day program due to this inherent conflict between the structure of the OASIS contracts and that final rule. And so the agencies who had become accustomed to using OASIS to fulfill their A-Day requirements were unfortunately in the difficult position of having to look elsewhere outside of this best-in-class contract to have those requirements filled. So as a result of that, GSA has spent the last few years in collaboration with the SBA to come up with a solution that would comply both with their final rule and their regulations as well as the overarching structure of OASIS. And so where we wound up is the idea of these subpools being created. The OASIS small business contract includes a section H15.4 focused on-ramping subpool creation, which allows GSA to create subpools in response to client needs, competition levels, or other factors. And the real distinction or the difference between subpools and the overarching OASIS small business pool and that on-ramping effort is the Small Business Pool 1, 3, and 4 on-ramping is to add additional small businesses to the pool that already exists. So we're not creating a new pool with the small business on-ramping effort. With the SubPool, on the other hand, which again is H15.4 of the contract, we're actually creating a brand new multiple award contract under each of these pools. So each SubPool will function as a distinct multiple award contract. It is still underneath the OASIS Small Business umbrella, but it's a separate and distinct contract from the small business pool that it corresponds to. And so an ordering contracting officer is going to have to pick either Small Business Pool 1, for example, or Small Business SubPool 1 if they have a requirement that is within the NAICS code of Pool 1. So they would pick SubPool 1 if they wanted it to be an 8A set-aside, essentially, or an 8A direct award. And so this complies with the SBA's rules in this regard because the actual SubPool itself is entirely an 8A set-aside contract. So you don't have this conflict of having a small business set-aside with further socioeconomic set-asides underneath it. You just have the 8A set-aside at the IDIQ level. So the SBA, after coming to agreement to the strategy, formally accepted the OASIS Small Business 8A SubPool solicitation into their 8A program in December of 2018. And so offer and acceptance of the actual awards will occur at the IDIQ level before we make award after the SBA determines eligibility. And that's going to be based on the 8A solicitation closing date for the date of eligibility. So you'd have to still be a current 8A participant at the time of the solicitation closing in order to qualify for the SubPool award. So just to get a little bit more in detail, to reiterate the structure and the architecture of how the SubPool would work, this 8A solicitation is limited to current 8A firms. All prospective awards will be offered to the SBA and to the 8A BD program before we make award, and the IDIQ level acceptance that the SBA will provide for those IDIQ awardees is going to be applicable for competitive 8A set-asides for the rest of the IDIQ contract, or until FAR 52-219-28 re-representation. I'm going to get a little bit into more detail on that on a further slide, but that shouldn't be a huge concern because that's going to occur pretty much at the end of the contract's lifespan. So for all intents and purposes, that IDIQ level acceptance is going to extend over the life of the IDIQ contract. Now, for direct or sole source 8A task order awards, that's still going to have to undergo offer and acceptance at the task order level. The SBA was pretty firm on that in order to have this sole source 8A task order, you need to be an eligible 8A concern at that time. So if you do enter the SubPool and let's say you graduate from the 8A program 2 years later, you can continue to accept sole source 8A awards up until that point in time. But then following that point, when you exit the program, at that point you'd only be eligible for the competitive 8A set-asides. And so just to reiterate, once we get the acceptance from the SBA into the program, we'll proceed to award at that point. Award is contingent upon SBA acceptance. So if you submit a proposal and you're evaluated and determined eligible, and we send it over to the SBA and they determine that you're not actually an eligible 8A business concern, you would not actually receive an award at that point. And as I'd mentioned previously, the date for your 8A status in terms of needing to be in the program is going to be the RFP closing date, which currently is scheduled to be June 20th, 2019. In the event that that date shifts in for some reason, it would just be that revised date. Okay, so this is the part of the SubPool solicitation process that can get a little confusing, so I'm going to try to explain it in a little bit more detail to provide a summary of kind of just how it's going to work. We've color-coded it, so there's two different pathways really to get into a SubPool. One is through the small business pool flow down, and pathway 2 is through 8A set-aside IDIQ level competition. And so when we're talking about flow down or pathway 1, it's going to be in green, and we use the term flow down. That's just something that we've invented. Pathway 2, we've got this orange text. So just to kind of help distinguish between the two different pathways to get into the contract. And I'll get into that in a little bit more detail in further slides, but just to go over the kind of overlying structure of how this will take place. Step 1 will be, proposals are due for small business pool on-ramping at the same time as the 8A. We're going to look at the small business pool. Once the number of anticipated awards are identified for that pool, and we've validated that a particular 8A company is in the top 190, for example, for pool 1, and that they meet the conditions to flow down into the subpool, we will consider them as flowing down into the subpool, and they'll be removed from consideration for the competitive 8A piece. Reason for that is there's a predetermined number of award slots that can happen through the competitive 8A set-aside, depending on each of the subpools. And there's not a limit to the number of awardees that can flow down from the small business pool. So if you're going to qualify for inclusion into the pool by way of a flow down, we don't want you to take up one of those valuable competitive spots that you wouldn't need to get because you're going to qualify to get into the pool anyway. So after we've looked at the entire composition of a pool, so let's say for pool 1, we've got 200 awardees in that pool, or prospective awardees. We figure out how many are going to flow down, and then those companies are, if they did submit a proposal in response to the competitive 8A solicitation, we would remove them from consideration for those awards. And then we would look at the list to see who's still eligible. So just to go into a little bit more detail about Pathway 1, the flow down. This is the specific contract language from section H15.4 of the contract, which establishes our authority for creating the subpools. Essentially what it says, any offeror already possessing a contract in the affected pool will automatically be included in the newly formed subpool if the offeror can provide pool qualification projects for the new subpool, with the exception of subpools limited to specific socioeconomic programs. And it goes a little bit into more detail about the socioeconomic programs. So what that means is if you are just a regular small business in pool 1, you're not eligible to flow down into an 8A subpool because we can set requirements saying you have to be an 8A business concern in order to flow down. So that language there kind of just provides that the flow down into the subpool is conditional upon factors such as socioeconomic status. As I'd mentioned before, there's no limit to the number of 8A contractors who flow down because we don't know how many of those 200 awardees for pool 1 or let's say 100 awardees for pool 4. We don't know off the top of our heads how many of them are actually going to be 8A concerns. That's going to be determined by competition. So based on how many members of that pool are an 8A business concern and meet the conditions to flow down, that's how many will flow down. So there's no limit there. That's kind of the benefit of that language in the contract that allows this kind of automatic qualification into the subpool. So it's not 100% automatic, this flow down. There are some conditions to the flow down process. So in order to flow down into the subpool, there are certain parameters and requirements of the subpool solicitation that the offerors must meet. And that's based on the fact that, the SBA has these requirements under the 8A Business Development Program. So we need to make sure that the offerors coming in from the small business pool comply with those requirements as well. So as I've mentioned a couple times, you're going to get sick of hearing it, the offeror must be an eligible 8A participant at the time of the subpool RFP closing. So if you received an OASIS award back in 2013 and you were an 8A business concern and you at some point since then have graduated and are no longer part of the 8A program, you unfortunately would not be eligible to flow down into the subpool because the subpool, again, as I mentioned, is considered a new contract. So the date for entering and for your eligibility is going to be determined on when that offer is submitted. So another thing to consider, SBA has provided guidance in response to, this is a statute that came out in, I believe, 2016, 15 USC 644 Q1B, which says that for multiple award contracts above the substantial bundling threshold. The government must consider the experience of first-tier subcontractors when we're looking at contractor teaming arrangements. And the SBA has provided us guidance that says that basically in order to qualify using that capability and that first-tier subcontractor experience, all of your first-tier subcontractors have to be eligible 8A participants. So one of the things to keep in mind there is if you are an 8A company and you're responding, for example, to the Small Business Pool 1, if you're going to want to take advantage of that flow down capability, you're going to want to make sure if you come in with any team members that they are also 8A business concerns. Now, that doesn't mean you're required to use only 8A business concerns. If you want to provide a proposal in response to Small Business Pool 1, you can certainly come in on Pool 1 with a team of non-8A concerns, and it just means that you would have to qualify for the subpool via Pathway 2 instead. And your proposal in response to the subpool, the 8A set-aside competition, might have a different team member composition than your pool level proposal. So, maybe you come in on the pool level with a team of subcontractors that are just small businesses, but on the 8A portion of it, you come in either using your own experience projects as an 8A or using the experience projects of other 8A concerns. So there's nothing that prevents you from doing that. It just means that that flow down capability will not extend to you because the team that you got onto the small business pool with would not be eligible to flow down. So hopefully that clarifies a little bit of the flow down element. It can be a little bit confusing. I definitely understand that. So Pathway 2, this is the 8A set-aside IDIQ level competition piece of it. So as I've mentioned, we'll figure out who's going to flow down into the subpool, who those awardees are, and then the 8A set-aside competition takes place. That's going to be based on these numbers in the chart in terms of the sort of competitive 8A set-aside anticipated numbers of awards. So that means after we figured out everyone who flows down into subpool 1, we'll make an additional 30 awards to 8A business concerns that have provided a proposal in response to the 8A solicitation. Same thing goes for Pool 2, Pool 3, Pool 4, Pools 2, 5B, and 6, just for your awareness, they're not currently being on-ramped as part of this sort of larger pool expansion on-ramping. So the number of companies who are actually going to flow down into subpools 2, 5B, and 6 are limited because the majority of those companies that are in those small business pools have been in the pool since the time of award in 2013, and because of that, they're unlikely to actually still be part of the 8A program. So it's possible that we may actually be prepared to make award for subpools 2, 5B, and 6 prior to award of the other subpools, because we don't have to wait for that flow down process to kind of work itself out to figure out who's left in the competition for the competitive piece of things. But the whole design of this flow down and then the competition is intended to make it so that we have the most, the highest number of contractors in the subpool be able to get there who are capable and represent a diverse skill set. And so we're looking to maximize competition at the task order level and maximize just really the number of companies that are in those subpools that are allowed to compete for these requirements. So this was driven, and just to get into where these numbers came from, it was driven in part by market research determining what 8A companies are out there, but another part of where these numbers have come from is also based on just historical order volume. Pools 1 and 3 in small business see the most order volume of task order requirements. So that kind of shaped why there's a little bit more room in those subpools and the numbers are a little bit higher. Another thing that you might be wondering is, I know that there's 7 OASIS pools and there's only 6 here. We made the decision not to create a subpool for Pool 5A because there's not a task order history under that pool, so it just doesn't make sense for contractors to expend the effort to get into a sub-pool when we're not really seeing any business volume in that NAICS code exception to begin with. It's a pretty specific field of work. It has to do with R&D for, I believe it's aircraft engine parts. So that's just something that is not getting the volume to justify an on-ramping to that particular pool, or sub-pool rather. So this next slide talks to a solicitation requirement regarding the 8A sub-pool on-ramping that is different from the small business pool. So I wanted to call attention to it. Part of that is basically, in order to validate that you are an eligible 8A business concern, we need a printout from the SBA Dynamic Small Business Search to accompany your offer. So that would just be like a PDF printout of, you enter in the company's DUNS number, and it shows a printout that says your 8A exit date and entrance date and everything like that. This is one slide actually where we do anticipate, so the material on this slide has changed from the original solicitation. This was just an oversight on our part. It was a mistake. The original solicitation has language that said that for a joint venture, an 8A joint venture, you would need to provide a DSBS printout showing that the JV itself is actually an 8A JV certified small, an 8A program member. That's actually not accurate because the SBA oftentimes determines approval for an 8A joint venture at the time of award or right before award. And so that was a mistake on our part. We didn't intend for that language to disqualify companies that had applied for the SBA 8A joint venture that had not yet been approved. So this is something I just want to call your attention to. If you are an 8A joint venture, where you're an 8A partnered with a non-8A company, you can still submit a proposal, and really what you'd need to upload in that case is just the Dynamic Small Business Search printout for the JV member who is an eligible 8A concern. So you would just provide the DSBS printout for the one participant member. You would still need to provide reps and certs for the other member to show that they're small. That's just based on an 8A company, an 8A joint venture of an 8A and another small business. There's also a different type of 8A joint venture, which is mentor-protege. In that case, the reps and certs don't have to show that the mentor is small, but there's other documentation that you would need to provide regarding your SBA-approved mentor-protege agreement and the certificate of compliance. So we do anticipate, and by the time that this presentation is made public, more than likely we will have issued an FBO amendment to correct this information. I appreciate the hundreds of 8A joint ventures who have brought to our attention the discrepancy between our solicitation and the SBA regulations, and I just want to set your minds at ease that we will accept proposals as long as one of the JV members is an 8A. Now, that's not to say that your award is automatic, because again, it's subject to acceptance by the SBA. So if you are identified as a prospective awardee, you're part of an 8A joint venture, and we contact the SBA to determine eligibility, and the SBA comes back and says, for some reason or another, their 8A joint venture request for approval has been denied, and they are not actually an 8A joint venture, you would not receive an award at that point. So your award is still contingent upon SBA approval. It's just not something that has to occur before you submit an offer. And then just to reiterate, for a prime subcontractor CTA, all members, and this again is based on SBA direct guidance to GSA regarding this, all members of the CTA need to be current 8A eligible concerns. So for that type of CTA, a prime subcontractor CTA, you are going to need to upload the DSBS printout demonstrating 8A program eligibility. And again, this is coming from the SBA. Finally, this is the last slide we have regarding the 8A subpools. This talks to contract requirements. So if you are to get a contract award for the subpool, you are going to be subject to FAR 52-219-28 re-representation. based on the timing of when proposals are due and when we expect awards to happen, more than likely, this third bullet here of re-representing your status within 60 to 120 days prior to the end of the 5th year of the contract will probably pretty much line up to the end of the 5th year of the contract, because the contract ends, regardless of when we make award, the contract has to be coterminous with the existing OASIS SB contracts, which end on December 19th, 2024. So what that means is you would have to, if the 60 to 120 days prior to the end of the 5th year of the contract hits before that point, you'd have to re-represent your size status. I would assume 60 days out, because not very many people re-represent early at the 120-day mark. But again, we are expecting it to probably more or less line up with the end of the contract. The other thing to keep in mind is that clause does require re-representation within 30 days after execution of either a novation agreement or a merger or acquisition that doesn't require a novation agreement. So just be aware of that, because any kind of change in ownership, that's something that people sometimes are not aware of. Any kind of change in ownership triggers that re-representation within 30 days. So if you're a company that, for example, has since graduated from the 8A program, you've exited it, or you're no longer a small business and there's a change in ownership that happens, be careful about that and just be aware of it, because when you do re-represent your size status as other than small, the terms and conditions of our contract require us to place you into dormant status, meaning you can no longer bid on task order awards. And the reason for that is because this is a total small business set-aside, and so agencies fulfill their total small business set-asides goals using this contract. And if we allowed businesses who have formally re-represented their size status as other than small to compete for these small business set-aside requirements, the whole contract more or less becomes no longer a small business set-aside. So unfortunately, that dormant status has to come in when re-representation as other than small occurs in order to protect the integrity of the contract as a small business set-aside. And the last point I just wanted to again reiterate, just so that people don't forget about it, is offer and acceptance for task orders is still going to be required at the order level for 8A sole source task orders, and SBA will confirm your continued eligibility at that point. So this is just something to keep in mind. If you are an 8A and it looks like your exit date is, in the near horizon, just keep in mind that the type of task orders that you're going to be eligible for will be competitive ones, and the sole source ones may not really be an option for you, just moving forward if you do receive an award. So that's just something to keep in mind. And I believe that wraps up the presentation regarding 8A subpools.